Good morning.
No mold.
No mold. No, they finally replaced the damn projector screen. Yes. We're all very happy about that. We're not going to be inhaling anything that might kill us. Lovely. So, I do want to start briefly today by saying a few quick words about the midterm paper. This paper is going to consider one work of your choice, right? Anything, let's say, up to and including the Euripides play. Right? Anything later than that won't really give you enough time to adequately think about this. So you can you can write about anything up to and including Medea, right? Which is what we're reading for next time. And what I want you to do with this, right? What you're going to do is perform a close reading on the text. Now, what close reading is essentially a slow, careful reading of a text with close attention to detail, right? Linguistic detail, details in imagery, even some cultural detail that we've discussed. And what you're going to do as you try to add up all of these details, right, is you're going to look for a particular pattern in the text that you think suggests a theme that is not otherwise obvious to the reader. And you're going to make an argument for the importance of that particular theme to the text, right? So you might, for example, notice a particular pattern in the way women behave in the Epic of Gilgamesh, right? And base an argument on that. You might notice particular attitude towards friendship in the Odyssey, and you could build your paper around that, right? The point is, right, what I want you to do is find concrete evidence for this particular theme and the way it's being treated in the text, and make an argument about that, right? So the paper is due on Monday, the 3rd of October. I'm not requiring drafts, but I'm willing to look at drafts. If you get a draft to me, say up to 48 hours before the due date, I guarantee I will look at it for you. After that 48-hour window is closed, I will look at it if I have time, but I can't guarantee that I will. Right? So if you can get me a draft 2 days before the due date, I promise I will look at it. I also do give extra credit to students who go to the Writing Center. So if you take your draft to the Writing Center and they send me an email that says, Devin came by and we looked at his paper and we went over blah, right? You will get half a letter grade bump, right? So your B plus paper becomes an A minus, right? Your B minus paper becomes a B, so on and so forth, right? We all understand math, right? We all understand how this works. Good. Okay. So just a few quick things about formatting the paper, right? This will all be posted on GeorgiaView, but just to sort of just go over it now for your benefit, in case you do have any questions, right now is the time to ask them. So your paper has to be submitted in 12-point type in Times New Roman font, right? So exactly the font that this assignment sheet is in. Please, please, please do not try to fiddle with funky fonts, right? No Comic Sans, no Courier New, none of that stuff, right? I want to see it in Times New Roman because 1, it looks nice and is easy to read, and 2, because it's all uniform size. MS Word has an annoying default where it puts spaces in between paragraphs. I want you to turn that default off, right? So what you do, in case you don't know how to do this, right, go up here to the line and paragraph spacing icon in the toolbar, and just click on, it'll say remove space after paragraph. Just click on that. If it says add space after paragraph, you're fine. Just use regular standard MS Word margins. What notation you do should be MLA style parenthetical with a works cited page at the end. even though you're only going to be quoting from one text, right? You're not allowed to use outside sources for this. So I do still want you to get into the habit of actually citing. So what I want you to cite not the name of the editor of the anthology, but the name of the author you're citing, right? So if you were, say, writing on the Sappho poems that you read for today, right? Say you're citing the poem one, the Hymn to Aphrodite, right? The citation would read in text, Sappho 469, and the period comes after. Also, I have a particular sort of pet peeve in student papers. It's what I like to call the floating quote. It's when you just drop quotes into a paragraph without really setting them up or explaining them. It's right. So you would say, Sappho summons the goddess Aphrodite to help her with her desire, and then you just drop in the quote from the poem, and then just go on talking. That makes me nuts. Don't do that. On the one hand, it suggests that what the quote says is self-evident. It's not, right? You always need to explain to me why the quote means what you think it means, and try to integrate it into your own sentences in some way so that it doesn't read as clumsy, right? So, right. As Sappho writes, blah, or the poem suggests this in line 12, colon, blah, right? Not that hard. Just connect the quote, make sure the quotes are connected to, integrated into your own sentences. And again, if you have questions about this or trouble doing this, come talk to me. I'll show you what I mean. Also, 4 to 5 pages means 4 to 5 pages. It does not mean 3 pages, nor does it mean 3.5. Right? I want to see at least 4 pages of text here, and I really don't want to see more than 5. If you're writing more than 5 pages, you've probably bitten off something that's a little bit too big for you to chew in this assignment, right? Yes, Jenna.
Is it double spaced or not double spaced?
It is. It will be. It should be double spaced. Yes. Yes. So 4 to 5 pages double spaced, and your works cited page does not count.
So about 14 to
Because that has to be there. What's that?
About 14 to 1,500 words.
Yeah, roughly 1,400, 1,500 words. Yeah. 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 Works cited page does not count. Right. That has to be there, and it's only going to be like 2 lines. Okay. So yeah, 4 to 5 pages of your actual text, your actual writing. And finally, the paper does need to be uploaded to the Dropbox in Georgia View by 11:59 p.m. on the due date. I go with 11:59 so nobody quibbles over when exactly midnight is. Okay? Okay. Now the reason I put all of this in here is like, look, longer ago than I care to remember, I was in your position, and I tried all sorts of little funny tricks to make my papers look longer than they really were, right? I squeezed in the margins a bit, I used weird fonts, I went with, just a little bit of extra spacing in between the lines, and my professors always caught it, right? Because they tried to do the same shit when they were undergrads, right? Every generation has tried to pull this off, and it never works. So, just stick with the guidelines, okay? Okay. All right, so as far as the actual grading standards are concerned for the assignment, right, I don't want you to think that all grading standards in an English class are completely arbitrary, right? It's not based on how much I like you, or it's not, how advanced your vocabulary is, or even, your grammatical flair, right? There are objective things that I am looking at, or that I'm looking for in your papers, right? The first thing I want to see is some level of originality, right? I will give you more credit for going out on a limb a little bit with an idea than for playing it safe, right? If you play it safe, it's like, well, I'm just going to go with something I can easily prove. You're probably not going to wind up with much more than a summary, right? So try to come up with something a little more daring, right? Try to tell me something that isn't obvious, right? Make sure that your idea is sufficiently complex and is actually arguable. Now, what do I mean by actually arguable?
There could be evidence presented against it.
Absolutely, yeah. You need to come up with something that another person could conceivably disagree with. Right, so, if I were to say, cookies are delicious, right? Like, no, that's not an arguable statement, right? That's just obvious. If I were to make an argument as to why a particular kind of cookie is superior, that would be, it might not be an argument worth having, but it would be better, right? So, in general, specificity is going to help you come up with a better thesis. And try to answer some kind of how or why question rather than simply a what question, right? Not this theme is present in the work, but how this theme operates in the work. That would be the better way to go. Right. And as I was saying, right, specificity, right? Your thesis needs to be rooted in some concrete details that you have taken from the text, not some general mood or feeling that you've extracted from it, right? I'm not your therapist. I'm not particularly interested in your. No, that actually sounds mean. It's not that I don't care about your feelings. It's just not what I want to see in your work, right? So if you're having a hard time getting past feelings, if you're having a hard time getting past emotional impressions, think back to whatever concrete details in the text are causing those emotional impressions, right? What is causing me to feel fear or anger or disgust as I read this? And then make that a starting point for your analysis, right? There's probably a pattern in there you can examine. Okay, second thing, slightly lesser, right? The most important thing is originality. I'm really more interested in your ideas. But clarity is important as well, right? And this is why grammar and style matter, right? You could have brilliant, original, amazing ideas, but if you can't make me understand those ideas, right? If you can't explain them to me in a clear and coherent way, does it matter? Right? I'm not going to get it. Right? You always have to keep in mind that you're writing for an audience that can't read your mind. So this is why grammar and style matter. Right now, I'm not a grammar Nazi, right? I'm not going to go through your paper and just, mark mistake, 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 mistake. As long as I can understand what you're trying to say, I'm not really that concerned about it. What I would like to see though is try to avoid really convoluted sentences. Don't use 10-cent words in places where a 2-cent word is more appropriate. Right? Don't try to write at what you think is a high academic level, right? Just explain to me your position in clear language. Make sure your paper is organized in a way that makes sense to a reader who can't read your mind. Right? Try to keep ideas that are related to each other together. Each paragraph should begin with a topic sentence, right? So each paragraph should have its own little mini thesis explaining what this paragraph is going to be about. Place related ideas in proximity to one another. Don't jump around. And make sure that you stick to one idea per paragraph, right? You can usually tell if you're doing this just simply by looking at the length of your paragraphs. If you've got one paragraph that is really, really, really long, you're trying to make it do too much, right? A good paragraph is usually about half a page long, right? So stick with a single idea in each paragraph. And finally, I did note this earlier, but it bears repeating. The relationship between evidence and your interpretation of it is usually less clear than you might think it is. So always make sure that you explain why your evidence means what you think it means, right? You always have to provide that kind of justification for your interpretation of the evidence. It might help you to think about this. There's a guy, a philosopher of rhetoric from Britain. His name is Stephen Toulmin. And he sort of thinks of argument as a kind of three-part structure. There are actually many, many more parts, but we're going to simplify this to the point of absurdity. So, my claim, right, the argument that I'm trying to make, I am a US citizen. The data that I use to back this up is that I was born in Pennsylvania. How does being born in Pennsylvania justify my claim to being a US citizen?
Because anyone born on U.S. soil is a U.S. citizen.
Exactly. So he would call this the warrant. Right? Anyone born on US soil is a citizen. Good. So just make sure that when you're connecting up your evidence to the claims you're trying to make, that you always provide that warrant, right? That you always provide that justification for interpreting the evidence in that particular way. Does anybody have any questions about this?
When writing Lit I Sappho, do we use just one of the poems or try to use the whole section?
If you're writing on a lyric poet like Sappho, because the amount of material we're dealing with is relatively small, you can use more than one poem. If you see like a consistent theme running through multiple poems, then yeah, you could use that. Yeah, James.
Will first person writing be allowed, or?
I know that a lot of you are probably taught in high school, right? Never use I in a paper, right? Bullshit. Of course you can use I in a paper. Professional academics do it all the time. One thing I would caution you about, though, if you find yourself using the first person too often in a paper, it means you're probably getting really subjective and you're probably getting into kind of personal emotional impressions. So I would say don't do it excessively because it prevents you from being objective. But yeah, I'm not going to mark you down for using I in a paper. That's ridiculous. Any other questions? No? Oh yeah, Ashley.
So with arguing like one point, like we only have to do that point. We don't have to reference like any opposing points, right? Because that's how like argument papers that go both ways.
Mm-hmm.
In a way, like you can't pick a side, but you have to argue both parties.
You do not have to argue both sides of an issue. No. Yeah, you're just looking for a particular theme, right? Now it might help you to look for evidence that also complicates your theme, because there are two things you can then do with that, right? You can either use it to, one, come up with a more specific, stronger thesis. It's like, okay, this works in these instances, but it doesn't work in these instances. What do I do with that? I have to come up with a thesis that encompasses both. Or you can also try to refute the arguments of the other side. So yeah, you are arguing for one particular position. And yeah, I will certainly regard your paper as more intellectually sophisticated if you take other viewpoints into account and deal with them, but you don't necessarily have to. Okay, other questions? That'll be something that'll be a bigger deal in the research paper. No other questions? Okay. Great. Well then, let me just reiterate again, right? You can give me drafts up until 48 hours before it's due, and I give you extra credit for going to the Writing Center, right? So do that. Go to the Writing Center, please. All right. So, I do also just want to quickly point before I take this down to a couple of things I put up for you to help you with the Sappho poems. The first is a website. It's simply called The Divine Sappho and includes links to information about her life, what little we know about her life. It contains links to other alternate translations of some of these poems. And also, if you scroll down, there are some articles about Sappho and her work. Most of these are older. They tend to fall into what we call public domain, right? That is, there's no one pressing the copyright claims anymore, so you can post them wherever the hell you want. But some of them still might be useful. Although I will say, we know a lot more about the ancient Greek world than we did in, say, 1950. So, right. I also included a link to Sappho's Epithalamion, the wedding hymn that I was playing at the beginning of the class here. This is an attempt to reconstruct what an ancient Greek wedding song would have sounded like. That's what epithalamion means. It's a term that simply means wedding song. There's another term for it, hymeneal. They mean more or less the same thing. Hymen was the god of marriage. And finally, we do also have posted here another BBC podcast, which is devoted to Sappho and her work. So give that a listen if you have time, right? Most of these are about 45 minutes long. All right, so that out of the way. Let's get to the poems and their contexts. How did this go for you? What'd you think? Pardon? Okay, why was it difficult?
Because it wasn't all together.
Uh-huh.
So you had the fragments of what from one idea to the next very quickly.
Yeah.
So you kind of had to look at those at the bottom to get a better understanding or read between pages better.
Yeah. Everything we've read up to this point pretty much has been narrative, right? Right, we've spent a lot of time on ancient epics or on sort of religious history chronicles, things that tell a more or less consistent story. Lyric poetry, which is what we're looking at here, lyric doesn't do that. Lyric may sometimes have narrative elements, right? We can see traces of stories in miniature in some of these poems, but the story isn't really what's important, right? A lyric poem is an expression of an emotion or an idea. It can also be, and these two meanings are not mutually exclusive, a poem written to celebrate a specific occasion. Like, for example, a hymeneal or an epithalamion written to celebrate a marriage. Right, so these are the two things we have to keep in mind here. One, these may be utterances of a particular emotion or an idea, or they may be written to celebrate particular occasions. In a lot of cases with Sappho's poems, we don't really know which was which. Right, because there's something else that makes these poems difficult, as Secret was saying, right? What else makes it difficult to get a consistent read on these? Pardon? The brackets, right? So yeah, we have only one complete poem. of Sappho's, right? Most of the ones we have, even if we have what we think is most of the poem, there are bits of it that are missing. And most of the things you read for today, right, aren't even listed here as poems in the translation, right? They're simply listed as fragments. We just have a couple of lines here and there from some of these poems. Now, why is it, do you think, that we have so much of the work that was attributed to Homer, right? It survived more or less intact, and so little of Sappho's lyric poetry? Can you come up with a theory as to why we have so little?
Maybe it's because she's a woman and it wasn't the culture system.
Okay, that's one theory. We do know, on the one hand, that the ancient Greeks tended to favor masculine interests over feminine interests, right? Ty, you had a hand up. You're going to say the same thing? Yeah, Jenna.
It could be, since we don't know that much about the island of Lesbos where she was born.
Mhm.
We don't know about the difference in culture on the island of Lesbos versus the culture that might have been different for Greeks. It could have been a more matriarchal society versus what was on the mainland, because it's
Sure.
different.
Yeah, and
So,
this is
maybe
another
more accepting of women, I guess.
and this is another thing to remember about Greece, is when we're talking about ancient Greece, we're not necessarily talking about a unified culture, right?
Yeah.
We're talking about a bunch of independent city-states that spoke the same language, worshiped the same gods, and sometimes had common interests.
It could be that their patron saint god was Aphrodite.
Mhm.
Because of that, it could have been that they worshipped women a little bit more than they did with men. It's just a difference in culture is what I'm just.
Okay, yeah, right. It could be, yeah, just a sort of difference in culture, because right, Lesbos is a small island off in the eastern Mediterranean. It would have been farther from the cultural center, or cultural centers, like Athens and Sparta. Somebody else had a hand up a second ago. Yeah, Taylor.
Does it have anything to do with like they were written down or saved?
Yeah, if we're talking, yes, in two ways, actually. That's actually very astute. One, if we're talking about lyric poetry, right, as spontaneous utterance of idea or emotion, or as celebratory chant for a particular occasion, how would these things have largely circulated originally?
By word of mouth?
Yeah, word of mouth. It'd probably be performed once, right? And then maybe somebody would write it down. Maybe not. Sappho probably wrote a lot more poetry than was actually even recorded. So yeah, on the one hand, the nature of the poetic style means that much of it was lost. Right? It wasn't meant to be memorized like epic and then re-recited over and over and over again to, tell the history of the tribe or what have you. Right? It was for particular occasions or particular emotions. And so, tended to be regarded as more ephemeral. Now, when they were written down, does anybody know what the most popular writing materials were in the ancient Mediterranean, around the ancient Mediterranean?
Parchment?
Parchment, no, would have come later.
Is it like papyrus paper or something like that?
Yeah, papyrus, right? It's this kind of paper made from reeds, and it's really, really fragile. Right? Papyrus doesn't hold up very well, especially in a wet climate. Right? The Egyptians used a hell of a lot of it. It was largely fine for them because it's friggin' desert. Yeah, Egypt is very dry. In fact, they would put mummies in papyrus wrappings. In fact, the last of the poems of Sappho's, right, this one that's labeled the New Sappho, was only recently discovered, and it was actually discovered on a mummy. Right? at the period when the Greeks ruled Egypt, someone had just taken whatever papyrus was lying around to wrap a mummy in, and one of the pieces happened to contain a poem by Sappho. So, yay mummification, I guess. But papyrus is really fragile, and particularly in wet climates, it tends to rot. It tends to deteriorate.
Maybe even their favorite poem.
It might have been
They take
something
that with them.
something to take with you to the afterlife. Yeah, Devin.
So you're saying they didn't really keep it up well, and like they didn't have a good area to keep it safe like the Greeks did?
Yeah. Well, I mean, yes and no. There were apparently scrolls and scrolls and scrolls containing poems by Sappho in the Library of Alexandria, but when the library was destroyed, so were most of the poems. So the only complete Sappho poem that we have is poem 1 here, this hymn to Aphrodite. And does anybody have any idea why this poem is complete? Why do we have this one and no others?
Carved into stone on something?
Good guess, but no. How do we know typically about, say, past figures whose works have otherwise vanished?
People wrote about them, and, when they were
Mhm.
making references and such.
Bingo. That's exactly what happened here. There was a scholar, a late Greek scholar, by the name of Dionysius of Halicarnassus, who wrote a treatise on composition.
What's that word?
What word? Halicarnassus?
Can you spell it?
Halicarnassus. So Dionysius was a rhetorician. And what he was most interested in was sort of the use of language to persuade. And he included this hymn to Aphrodite written by Sappho as an example of one of his sort of 3 styles of rhetoric. Right? The first he called austera, or austere. And this was characterized by sort of rough or abrasive sounds. The second he called glaphyra, or smooth. And the smooth style contained no dissonant sounds, right? No sounds that would be unpleasing to the ear or harsh, right? Nice rounded vowels, a soft but elegant meter, usually what we call a falling meter, that is sort of favoring unstressed syllables. And it gave the effect of a sort of continuous utterance, right? That it was a sort of continuous speech that was happening more or less spontaneously. The third style he called eukrate, or mixed, right? Blended the two. Now Sappho's poem is quoted by Dionysius as an example of glaphyra, of this smooth style. Right, so 1, this is evidence that her work was well known outside of her own circle on the island of Lesbos. And this is what she was well regarded for, right? for making these kinds of sounds in her poetry, right? Now, this is stuff that doesn't really come through, unfortunately, in translation. Right. Was there anything else that you noticed about these poems, or that made these poems particularly difficult, or that you thought was weird about them, or interesting? Yeah, Jenna.
What I thought was interesting about poem 31
Okay.
was how it can connect to modern day feelings of explanation of love and stuff like that.
Okay.
It's very explanatory about how she was feeling in that moment, and often describes how we feel in a moment of similarity.
Uh-huh. What seems to be the emotion that she's describing in poem 31? If we look on page 471 here, right?
Nerves and seeing, like jealousy.
Okay.
Heartbroken similarly.
Okay.
Like she just said. But general anxiety over the fact that the person that she's watching is with someone else and not herself.
Okay. So yeah, let's look at the poem more closely here, right? So yeah, this is often called the jealousy poem. But the emotion described here is actually more complicated than jealousy for cultural and rhetorical reasons that we'll get to in just a minute. Can I get a volunteer actually to read it? Okay, yeah, go for it.
He seems to me equal to God, but man, whoever he is, who opposite you sits and listens close to your sweet speaking. And lovely laughing, oh, it puts the heart in my chest on wings. But when I look at you, even a moment, no speaking is left in me. No, tongue breaks and thin fire is racing under skin, and in eyes no sight, and drumming fills ears, and cold sweat holds me and shaking, grips me all. Greener than grass, I am and dead, or almost I seem to be. But all is to be dared, because even a person of poverty.
And then, of course, we don't know how it ends. That's where it cuts off. But yeah, the feeling here looks a great deal like jealousy, right? The speaker in the poem, and we can't always assume that the speaker is supposed to be Sappho herself. Sometimes she names herself in the poem, but sometimes she does seem to be taking on a persona.
I actually felt it was less jealousy and just more sadness.
Okay.
Like less, I mean, I know I can see the jealous part of it, but I just feel more an emotion of general depressed. I won't say depressed, just sad.
What in the poem suggests to you sadness? Connected to evidence.
Just I am and dead, or almost I seem to me. Because generally when people think of depression and stuff, it's this feeling of nothingness, wanting to be dead, or see sadness in general because you see someone like that.
Okay.
So I would say it was more sadness.
Okay, Ty, what do you want to add?
I would argue that it's more anger than anything.
Okay, what suggests anger to you?
That no tongue breaks and thin fire is racing on my skin.
Uh-huh.
It's like, you know, when people get angry, like everything just becomes a blur.
Okay, yeah, she's getting heated up, right? So let me just say a couple of things about the cultural context for this, right? Now, if you were an ancient Greek, most of your important relationships would be not necessarily homosexual, but homosocial. What I mean by this, right, is that people largely only associated with members of their own gender, right, with members of their own sex, right? Men associated with men, sometimes sexually, sometimes not. Women associated with women, sometimes sexually, sometimes not. In general, marriage in ancient Greek culture was a kind of transaction. Essentially, a man married a woman in order to, one, get a dowry, right? So he gets some money or property, for doing so, and to father children upon, right? So that he has some sort of line of descent, right? Preferably sons, right? Because sons got you money by collecting dowries, daughters cost you money by requiring dowries. So by and large, men and women didn't otherwise associate with each other all that much, right? A man who spent too much of his time hanging around with women was regarded as unmanly. Women were regarded as sexually voracious, irrational, and prone to emotional outbursts. Whereas the Greek ideal was one of extreme rationality, right? Logical, cold, balanced in personality. In fact, does anybody know where our word hysteria comes from? When we describe a state of hysteria, what do we mean by it? If someone's acting hysterical.
Just irrational, generally unable to be controlled.
Yeah, it's a state of extreme emotional disturbance, right?
It's basically panicking.
Yeah. Hyster is the Greek word for uterus. Right? So our word hysteria comes from the ancient Greek conception of women as being these sort of, like, to a Greek in a lot of ways, like, all women are emotionally unbalanced nymphomaniacs, right? So marriage was often regarded as a sort of necessary evil by men in particular. So what we have here in this poem, right, we have a female speaker celebrating the beauty of another woman who she sees talking to a man. Now, from what little we're able to reconstruct of Sappho's life, she seems to have run some sort of academy for young girls on the island of Lesbos, the purpose of which was ultimately to prepare them for marriage. They learned dance, they learned song, they seem to have learned certain arts of seduction as well, which we see sort of teased out in some of the other poems. There's, the poem when they talk about flower garlands and oil of myrrh. Right? These were regarded as devices for asking the charites, the goddesses of beauty, to bestow upon you erotic appeal. Right? So, come to me, charities, make me sexy. I am wearing flower garlands. Right? So, Sappho often combines marriage imagery with funeral imagery, in part because when one of her girls is getting married, that means she's leaving this circle of initiates, right? She's leaving this social group, right? This apparently very tightly knit society. And she's being taken from the society of women into her husband's home, right? And marriage for an ancient Greek woman involved a kind of total separation, right? You're taken away from your family, you're taken away from your friends, and you're plopped down in somebody else's house. They may live very far away from your family, from your friends, from the life that you know. And so, Sappho often treats this almost as a kind of death, right? Now, as far as this particular poem is concerned, the key phrase here, according to some readings of it, the ones that seem to me actually most convincing, is that it is kind of a jealousy poem, but in a roundabout sort of way. The key term here in the first line is, he seems to me equal to gods, that man. Now, godlike tends to have a very specific meaning in Greek poetry. Right? We see this as the standard epithet of praise in the Iliad and the Odyssey, right? God-like Achilles, God-like Hector, God-like Odysseus, right? God-like Priam. And what it means, what it suggests, is some combination of larger-than-life qualities. And what makes this guy godlike, what makes him larger than life, if we look at his emotional response to the girl that he's talking to, right? He seems to me equal to gods, that man, whoever he is opposite you, sits and listens close to your sweet speaking and lovely laughing. Does he apparently have fires under his skin? Does it clam him up or close his tongue? No. He is simply conversing and enjoying it, right? So what makes him godlike is that he can speak to this beloved woman without freaking out the way the speaker does, right? The speaker gets all nervous and knock-kneed and tongue-tied in the presence of this beautiful woman. This man doesn't. So, the speaker is jealous of the man, but not entirely in the way that seems obvious to us, right? So that's how, yeah, Devin, go ahead. Oh, it looked like you had a question or a comment. Okay, no? All right, so there is often a lot more going on under the surface of these poems that just sort of requires a little bit of cultural context to pull out, right? Yeah, Ashley.
So, are you saying that basically that poem's kind of more like she cared for that girl because she had that academy thing or whatever? But then, like in the beginning, or like where it said like a little bit about Sappho,
Yeah.
it said that she was also kind of like rumored to be like a lesbian. So is it more like she actually had a relationship with this girl, or
Yeah, well,
it was like one of her little minions?
Well, maybe a little from column A and a little from column B, right? She does seem to celebrate both sexual and platonic love between women. And again, we just sort of have to think about this in terms of ancient Greek attitudes towards sexuality, which are a little bit more complicated than sort of simple straight gay binaries, right? The Greeks wouldn't have recognized the idea of sort of straight or gay, right? That somebody was just sort of, one particular thing. There were some men who clearly preferred men, some who spent most of their time with men, and we know actually very little about how women spent their time or what attitudes towards women's sexuality were. Now, what is inferred by a lot of scholars is that sexual relationships between women were largely either ignored or even, perhaps smiled upon by their husbands because there's then no... let me put it to you this way. What was the most important function a man's wife had in ancient Greece?
Give him sons.
Give him sons, give him children, yes. And as long as the romantic rival is someone who isn't going to interrupt that line of succession, who isn't going to, who isn't going to produce children on his wife that are not his. Who cares? Yeah, Devin.
So basically, if they spent like a lot of time with their wives, they'd just be called unmanly.
Exactly. Yes. Yes. It was considered much more like masculine behavior meant hanging out with other men pretty much all of the time.
But they didn't think nothing about it when they're gay.
No.
Or-
No. Well, I mean, and again, like they wouldn't have recognized that distinction. Even most men who preferred sex with other men probably still had wives and children, because that was a sort of social duty.
It was sort of like when they go into their bonding experience, or at least this is what I've heard, in their
Mhm.
bonding experience for war in the Greek culture, it was natural for them to bond with men by having sex. It was natural for them to do that.
That was actually specific to the city-state of Thebes.
Oh,
But
okay.
yeah,
But I
yeah,
have heard that.
there was a particular elite Theban military unit where that was the practice. They were called the Sacred Band of Thebes. But I mean, like those sorts of practices were not uncommon. Yeah, and so it is thus reasonable to assume that because women largely only socialized with other women, there were probably similar practices. And the fact that Sappho's poetry does not seem to have attracted any sort of moral opprobrium from other Greek authorities, despite celebrating love between women, suggests also that this wasn't really something they saw as a problem or as an issue. Plus, if you think about some of the particularly militaristic city-states like Sparta, all of the aristocratic men in the city were essentially gone for 9 months out of the year waging war. So the women they left behind found other ways to amuse
It
themselves.
also could be, or this, my thought, is that to keep women from being with other men, it would be normal for them to not push, but like, I guess the only word coming to mind is inspired their wives to be with other women instead of other.
I don't know if there would sort of be actively inspiring going on, but
I'm just talking
certainly.
about smile upon it.
Yeah, they wouldn't be much concerned about it because again, there's no chance of procreation there, and that would be the thing that they would have been worried about, right? Okay, so yeah, Jalen.
Is Poem 16 like
Yeah.
sort of clarifying different sexuality or?
Well, Poem 16 actually is it's a kind of formulaic Greek poem, right? It's I wouldn't say it's necessarily clarifying anyone's sexuality because the waters of Greek sexuality are by and large pretty muddy or pretty murky to us. We're not used to really thinking of sexuality in these terms. But what she is doing, right, this is an example of a kind of rhetorical formula that the Greeks loved to trot out at dinner and drinking parties called a priamel. And a priamel essentially is a list of superlatives. So it's a kind of game in which the players compete to come up with the best example of some particular thing, right? So Achilles is the greatest of heroes because of X, Y, and Z. No, Odysseus is the greatest of heroes because of X, Y, and Z, right? No, Heracles is the greatest of heroes because of X, Y, and Z. And eventually we sort of come to some sort of conclusion where we determine, okay, this is the best hero, this is the greatest of heroes because of these particular criteria. So what this gives us is something a little different, right? Some men say an army of horse, and some men say an army on foot, and some men say an army of ships is the most beautiful thing on the black earth. But I say it is what you love. So what sorts of things is she saying? Like, well, first off, what is the superlative she's going for here? Most what?
To name what is the most beautiful thing?
Yep, what is the most beautiful thing? Yeah, and she says it's whatever you love that is the most beautiful thing. What does she say some men say are the most beautiful things? Yep.
Armies and warfare.
Yep, army, horse, ships. Yep, these images associated with war. And she says it is whatever one loves. Easy to make this understood by all. For she who overcame everyone in beauty, Helen, left her fine husband behind and went sailing to Troy. Not for her children nor her dear parents had she a thought. No, led her astray. For lightly reminded me now of Anactoria who is gone. I would rather see her lovely step and the motion of light on her face than chariots of Lydians or ranks of foot soldiers in arms. So, what's the metaphor she veers off into here in the middle of this?
How,
It's under the Trojan War.
Yeah, beginning of the Trojan War. And how does she frame this?
how she said how Helen left, even though she was been kind of taken in a different setting, like story.
Yeah, she says that Helen followed the thing that she loved, right? The thing that was most beautiful to her. The thing that was most beautiful to her was not her fine husband, not her children, not even her elderly parents, but apparently this Trojan prince Paris, right? So the thing that was most beautiful to her, she followed. And damn the consequences. And then she herself is then reminded of Anactoria who is gone. Now gone could mean a couple of different things here, right? Gone could mean dead. But in the social context we're talking about of Sappho's circle, what does it more likely mean? Yep, married and moved away, right? Anactoria has grown up, she is married, she is left. I would rather see her lovely step and the motion of light on her face than chariots of Lydians or ranks of foot soldiers in arms. So we return to that military analogy that we had at the beginning, right? Where the most beautiful things to some men are these, these implements of war. But the most beautiful thing to me is the memory of Anactoria who is gone. More beautiful it is to me than any of these other things. So what she's doing here in a way is actually kind of mixing up what she thinks is most beautiful with what men thinks or with what men think is beautiful, and using it to reimagine the Trojan War. Right? That it's not that Helen gets, tossed in a sack and shipped off to Troy. No, she goes willingly on her own to follow the thing she loves.
Is it possible that she had wanted Anactoria? That's a completely thought that's thought of, but that she wanted Anactoria to do the same, to find that the most beautiful thing in her life was Sappho, and to follow what she wanted rather than...
Well, what is Anactoria's current state?
She's married. Assume.
Well, in the poem, the one thing we know about Anactoria is that she's gone.
I'm just talking about, did she...
Yeah, so she's not going to hear this.
I know, I'm just saying, maybe it was her silent desire that she would do what Helen did. Could that be possible in comparison?
I don't know that the poem quite gives us enough evidence for that. I think it's just more sort of about the beauty and sweetness of the memory. Right, and that, I would rather have this peaceful memory of singing and dancing than, these thoughts of horses and chariots and warships trampling all over
I was just
everything.
thinking in particular comparison she used to Helen of Troy.
Sure.
Being on her own rather than going unwillingly.
Yeah, well,
That would be my evidence.
yeah. Well, if Anactoria is gone, then is Sappho in the position of Paris or the position of Menelaus? Yeah, she's in Menelaus' position, not Paris' position. The one who was left.
Time to give Russell a nice dance and get it back.
Yeah, I don't, I think that that's exactly what she's saying. She doesn't want to happen.
Well, that's improvement history. We'll have to go.
All right, so one more poem I just want to look, I do want to look just at this only complete poem that we have, this hymn to Aphrodite, in the time we have left. I think we've got about 10 minutes or so before class is over. What did you think of this poem? Did you have any thoughts about this poem?
The poem one.
Poem 1, yep. Page 469.
She seems to be very fond of Aphrodite and wants her to,
Yeah, what,
I don't know how to put it into words.
yeah, what's the implied relationship here between the speaker and the goddess?
Allies.
Okay, allies how? Why would you say allies, Frank?
She is seems to be calling upon Aphrodite to help her to give her her favor
Uh-huh.
and pursuing some relationship
Yeah.
that is, troubling or something.
Yeah, it's
Hard to pursue.
it's a request for aid, right? It's a request for help. In fact, this follows the general pattern of what are sometimes called the Homeric hymns. Right, there's a series of poems in praise of the gods. Right, one for each important god, sometimes more than one for certain gods, that are attributed to the poet we call Homer, even though a lot of scholars think that these are probably the work of a different poet or a different set of poets. But they tend to follow a single pattern, right? One, the deity is flattered. Deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind, child of Zeus, who twists lures, I beg you, do not break with hard pains, O lady, my heart. Secondly, the deity is reminded of other occasions on which he or she helped and is then asked to do likewise. Right now. But come here if ever before you caught my voice far off, and listening left your father's golden house and came, yoking your car. And fine birds brought you, quick sparrows over the black earth, whipping their wings down the sky through midair. They arrived. But you, O blessed one, smiled in your deathless face, and asked what now again I have suffered, and why now again I am calling out, and what I want to happen most of all in my crazy heart. Whom should I persuade now again to lead you back into her love? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? For if she flees, soon she will pursue. If she refuses gifts, rather she will give them. If she does not love, soon she will love even unwilling. So, who's actually doing the reminding of past occasions here in the situation?
Aphrodite.
Yeah, Sappho has reversed the typical situation, right? Usually, it's the suppliant, the person praying, who reminds the gods of past similar occasions on which they've helped. This time, it's Aphrodite reminding Sappho that this is not the first time she's called on her, right? And what sort of tone does Aphrodite seem to take with Sappho?
It kind of seems like she's aggravated.
Yeah, it's
Keep mocking.
Now
Yeah.
again,
yeah,
you're
it's
asking me something.
yeah. It sounds exasperated, right? It's like, what do you want now, right? Stop bothering me. Who has broken your heart this time? Who, O Sappho, is wronging you? Come to me now. Loose me from hard care and all my heart longs to accomplish. You be my ally. So these poems usually almost always end with a specific request for aid. Right? So you start by flattering the deity. You then remind the deity of other occasions on which he or she has helped you. Ask them to do likewise now and make your specific request for aid. Right? This is what I want from you. And there's even the first part of this is a little bit messy given the form, right? The way the line is translated here, the first line is, deathless Aphrodite of the spangled mind, child of Zeus who twists lures. Right? Spangled, or the word that's here translated as spangled, can on the one hand mean glittering and glorious, but it can also mean fickle. So there's a kind of mockery encoded into the praise term, right? Oh, glittering and glorious Aphrodite, who is also fickle.
So at the same time she is mocking Aphrodite, and she's also having Aphrodite mock her.
Yeah, there seems to be some sort of equal opportunity mockery here, right? But I think one of the things that this gets us at is this isn't quite a straight hymn, right? It's more linguistically complicated than that, right? Child of Zeus who twists lures. What does this suggest about how she views Aphrodite's activities? What does Aphrodite do?
She makes people fall in love or control their emotions.
Yeah. What does it mean to twist a lure specifically? How does she make people fall in love?
She baits them.
Is this...
Like makes it into her own. Like she does things how she wants to, not how the person who may be falling in love would seem to.
Yeah. What does it mean? Like, what kind of metaphor is twisting a lure?
Twisting the strings of a lure until they're complicated and messy, so they can no longer play right.
Well, no, you're thinking of a lyre. You're thinking of like a lure. Who uses a lure?
Fisherman.
A fisherman or a hunter, right?
Oh, no.
Yeah. Aphrodite who makes traps, who suckers people in.
Who
Yeah. Sucker someone in for me. So, for a hymn, right, this really ends up being pretty irreverent. Right? Not only does the speaker mock herself and the desire she expresses, she also mocks the goddess she's requesting these favors from. It's like the goddess who inspires these kinds of feelings in the first place. Okay, we're about out of time. Does anybody have any questions about any of this? All right, we'll give you the-
She died.
What's that?
We know Sappho died.
We do not. There's a legend that she threw herself off a cliff for love of some young ferryman, but it has no historical basis. We don't know how she died. We don't know when she died.